Welcome to our webinar, where we'll be looking at the benefits of integrating ESG reporting with financial reporting processes and the value this will bring to your organisation. My name is Carrie and I'll be your host for this session. So just before we begin, I'll go over a few housekeeping points. The webinar will last about an hour and we'll have a short question and answer session up towards the end. You can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A or chat function. And if you have any technical issues, please let us know and we'll do our best to assist. This session is being recorded, so we'll share a link with you all afterwards. So if I just quickly give you an overview of the agenda. So firstly, I'll introduce our speakers. Then we'll touch on the ESG reporting imperative and how it intersects with the Office of Finance. Then our speakers, David and Martin, will do a deep dive into how FirstGroup plc successfully integrated ESG and financial reporting in OneStream. After which, Simone will give you all a look at OneStream's ESG reporting and planning solution. And we'll answer any questions you have at the end. So I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. We've got David Watson. David's the Managing Director of Concentric Solutions. He has over 25 years of experience in finance systems and corporate performance management. As the first OneStream partner in Europe, David has led Concentric Solutions in cutting-edge solutions spanning financial consolidation, planning and reporting, ESG reporting, and the developing AI and machine learning domains. Martin is the Group Director of Corporate Responsibility at FirstGroup plc, which is one of the leading providers of public transport in the UK. He's an influential sustainability leader with 20 years of experience driving corporate sustainability strategy, regulatory alignment, and climate action across FTSE 250 and global organisations. Simone is a Senior Solutions Consultant at OneStream Software and has over 15 years' experience improving financial systems and processes. OneStream is the industry's most comprehensive cloud-based platform for the Office of Finance, unifying financial and operational data and processes for better reporting, planning and forecasting. So now I'll hand over to David to get us started.
Thank you, Kerry, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. I hope you get value from the session. I'm going to start by assuming that we'll probably have a portion of the audience who are joining specifically for the ESG element of the agenda, and a portion of the audience who are probably joining from a finance background interested in ESG. So with that being said, the purpose of this session is to bring into focus the value of integrating ESG and financial reporting. Now, CPM, or Corporate Performance Management, or EPM, Enterprise Performance Management, are synonymous in the world of corporate finance. And it's evolved over a period of time. So going back 20 odd years when I first started, as Carrie mentioned, we had point solutions that addressed different elements of the reporting and close process around large corporate organizations. Over time, the technologies that served those individual processes became acquired under the banner of, in cases of, the more well-known brands, SAP, Oracle, IBM, and then more recently, emerging players have converted some of those platform or suite offerings into cloud-based platforms, and that's where we land today. So the agenda that is served day in, day out by the Office of Finance comprises not just making up the numbers for year-end reports, the statutory reporting, but also the management analytics that form the decision-making process or support the decision-making process of how these organizations run and operate. And it's with that as an underlying backdrop that we've considered, how do we move beyond finance into other peripheral areas, one of which is now ESG. So with that being said, there are many reasons why we need to take ESG seriously. Regulatory pressures. So as many of you will be aware, large corporate organizations now, depending on your jurisdiction or geography, need to comply with disclosures relating to ESG. And as I'm sure you're also well aware, some of those disclosures are underpinned by standards that are still evolving. what we need to consider is how do we address that from a systems context, and how do we actually provide the tools to support dealing with, in the UK SRSs or ISSB standards, in Europe CSRD standards, etc., etc. And that pressure to report to a standard is nothing new to finance. Finance do that day in, day out, and have the controls, the structures, the data governance in place to enable large organizations to report to financial standards. So there is immediately an alignment in terms of what we're looking to achieve here from an ESG reporting perspective. Second, investor focus now comes in different forms, whether it's introduction of sustainable business practices or good corporate citizenship in terms of social responsibility. All of that is being measured and is driving how investors invest in different organizations that are publicly listed. And then finally, I think the third key area is stakeholders within organizations that are responsible to external investors or business owners need to be able to access reliable, transparent, and more importantly, relevant ESG data. So this has become the responsibility of finance, as BDO have called out here, and Forbes, partly because of that compliance and control mandate, and partly because the two worlds have now merged in some senses. You may or may not have heard of the concept of double materiality, but what it boils down to is the decisions that an organization makes. Are those decisions driven purely by financial goals, or are those decisions also accounting for the risks and opportunities to the business of either accounting for or not accounting for ESG or social responsibilities? Finally, in terms of the analogy I'm going to draw to the EPM world here, the first and foremost agenda point here is compliance. Compliance in itself, though, is not the only agenda. Compliance is just the start. And if we look at this wagon wheel of finance processes on this slide, you start with setting long-term financial horizons, monitoring how you achieve that, and then reporting on how you did it. It's exactly the same in ESG. We need to understand what are the targets that an organization is going to set to achieve net zero. How is the business progressing against those targets? And, what levers do they have that they can pull to understand how to get there quicker? So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Martin Wayman. We at Concentric are fortunate to have engaged with FirstGroup. FirstGroup have implemented OneStream for management reporting, statutory reporting, and budgeting and planning. And more recently, we've worked with Martin and his team to look at how we integrate and unify ESG reporting within that solution. So as Carrie said at the beginning, FirstGroup is a well-known operator of rail and bus networks here in the UK, and so very much at the forefront of looking at how greenhouse gas emissions and the sort of ESG metrics need to be reported. So Martin, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, David, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Thanks for inviting me along, and as David said, I hope this session is useful for those on the call. Just to introduce myself, as David said, I'm Group Director of Corporate Responsibility at FirstGroup. My role entails looking after our sustainability approach within the business, covering both environmental and social impact. As part of that, I look after all our disclosures on that topic, or all our ESG disclosures, be they in our kind of annual report or on our website, or all the various kind of ESG benchmarks that as a listed PLC we're required to report against. So that's the sort of, for the purposes of this session today, an overview of my role and what my team does. And I suppose one of the key areas of focus for us are within that broad area of sort of ESG is carbon emissions. So like most large organisations, we've been reporting our carbon emissions for a number of years, long before I joined, about 4 years ago. But around the time I joined, the company was in the process of setting its first science-based target. Hopefully some of you on the call are aware of, but if you're not, it's a very rigorous approach by which an organisation is required to set a plan to reduce its emissions in line with the reductions set out in the Paris Accords of 2015, ideally so that as a world and as a company, we can help ensure that emissions don't go past the 1.5 degree warming threshold. And so that setting that target, I suppose, was a watershed moment for us in terms of how we then thought about gathering and reporting our carbon data, given the importance of that target being set and what it meant for the business, really.
So thank you, Martin. So if we talk in practical terms, then what motivated the decision to enhance FirstGroup's ESG reporting?
Well, I think we had a good enough process for gathering and reporting our data, but I think the setting of that target, in a sense, was a step change. At the same time, once that target was set, the first time we included ESG metrics in our executive remuneration approach. We also included certainly carbon metrics in a revolving credit facility that we established at a similar sort of time. So the importance, I suppose, of particularly our carbon data just effectively went up a notch massively. And therefore, we thought it was a good opportunity to understand steps we could take to improve the gathering, consolidation and reporting of that data, really.
So can you maybe share a little bit around the key challenges that were associated with how you dealt with that in the previous process before OneStream?
Yeah, in a nutshell, there were a few characteristics I would use to describe the former way of doing things. One was it was incredibly manual. It relied upon a network of, not just in the group functions, but the divisions of ideally full-time sustainability teams, or the next best thing, to provide us with the requisite kind of data from their division that we could then use to gather up and report our carbon emissions. So it in effect relied upon relationship building in the first place, and then really quite a manual process that was, in all honesty, quite spreadsheet driven, quite Excel driven, where templates were sent out. A sort of time frame was provided for those kind of stakeholders of the business to complete the information needed, and ultimately send those spreadsheets back to us for sort of onward consolidation by us. So we lacked a system, in all honesty, to gather and report it, and was very manual in nature, and because of that was, I suppose, beset with all the risks that go with that way of doing things, really.
So with that being said, then I'm aware that you looked at a number of potential technology solutions or choices.
Yeah.
What drove the decision to land on OneStream, and why is that, in your mind, the right solution for your ESG reporting?
Yeah, so around the time that we were thinking about this, I suppose the ESG thing, to be simplistic about it, kind of exploded, and about 4 or 5 years ago. And at that time, we certainly were contacted by a number of providers of essentially sort of SaaS ESG platforms that we could use, I suppose, to gather and report data in a more system-based way that I was, that would have improved things. So we didn't lack options, I suppose, and we did look around the market at that time to see what else was out there and consider our options. But I suppose the reason we ultimately went with OneStream is twofold, really. One, it was already within our business, as you said at the start of the call. So we were using it for our financial reporting, and that means quite a lot, really. In simple terms, what it means is that there's a whole team within your business who, in some ways, have done the groundwork of structuring the system such that it recognises your divisions and your hierarchies and your reporting periods, for example. All those kind of things that you might have to start from scratch with an off-the-shelf solution. You don't have to do when the system's already in your business. So that that was one advantage. And I suppose that linked to that, we had, I suppose, a curiosity as well to see how we could leverage a system that was already in place in the business to get the data that we needed, in the hope that it might already been used for financial reporting purposes. For example, anyone who knows about carbon reporting will know that you fundamentally need utility data, sort of energy bills, basically. And, sure enough, those were already being kind of tracked by our financial reporting colleagues. So there was a curiosity about how we could already not just use the sort of structures and hierarchies that were set up, but also the data within it, as opposed to, again, just starting from scratch with what would have been a new system.
So if just picking up on that, then how has the collection of that carbon data from across the business changed?
Hugely, basically. So there is now just so much more rigor to it. There's also a lot more frequency to it. So whereas before that manual process I was talking about, when I first joined, was on an annual basis, we managed to move it to a sort of 6-monthly basis after a couple of years. But now with OneStream, we're moving to a period by period basis. I suppose the rigor as well has really kind of been transformed, insofar as the data itself is that there's a single point of truth now and is locked down, and the workflows are structured such that there's a very clear lineage from somebody in the business inputting the data and the data being locked to somebody then reviewing it, and then it then coming to us for validations and so on. And at no point can the data be changed or altered without any sort of without any sort of clear accountability, etc. So there's a lot more rigor to it as well. And I suppose thirdly, it's early days because we've been using it for the first time this year, but I would say just the sheer amount of time and resource needed to do all those tasks has reduced significantly. And so we're instead, for the first time, being able to spend that time that's been freed up to instead kind of look at insights that we can see in the data, and especially on a period by period basis, perhaps track how we're performing on our carbon target on a much more frequent basis than we were able to before.
Great. And I think, as with any project of this nature, it's more than just the technology that matters. It's also the process change and the people, as you've just touched on.
Yeah.
If we touch on how OneStream's helped you introduce standardization, because I think that was one of the things, just again, drawing an analogy from the Office of Finance world, we're used to dealing with getting data out of a multitude of different source systems. And one of the key challenges that we regularly see here is actually going to people in the organization who don't report to finance, who have had to actually adjust to the fact that they now need to produce this information. So I think, can you maybe talk to what you see as the key aspects in the new reporting model that makes this work in OneStream?
I think there's been huge improvements there as well, quite frankly, because whereas before we would go to them with a request and perhaps a sort of template to be completed that was, as I said, a spreadsheet, they perhaps didn't take the task as seriously. And again, perhaps because it was spreadsheet driven, felt that it was okay to, perhaps send us a different spreadsheet a week later once they found a different kind of set of data, etc. So it was just there was a bit of less control, I suppose, over the process, which is something to be said for having a system where people can log on and, as I said, their workflows are being tracked and they can see the oversight they're subject to much more clearly, has definitely improved the completeness and accuracy of the data that they put in and the seriousness with which they take the task, I think. And we also supported them in it, and that's maybe part of it too. There was, we upped our game as well in the central team, because obviously in order to use a system, you need to be trained on how to do it. And so we took real care in creating kind of mini bite-sized training sessions on how to use all the kind of aspects of OneStream and all the functionality within it, and to understand that they were able to fully do all the tasks we needed them to. And so in that sense, the system helped us up our game, because we felt we really kind of went to town on process and making people aware of the process. and in a sense probably strengthen those relationships with the internal stakeholders by doing that, by showing how invested we were in it as well,
Yep. Great. And I think just thinking at the other end of the chain as well, once you've got that data in from the site locations, can you talk a little bit now around how, for example, you calculate the greenhouse gas emissions in OneStream?
Yeah, well, again, there it's all about kind of reducing the manual bit, the risk of sort of human error. And again, there, whereas before, perhaps at the divisions, people would input their own emission factors. For those on the call not familiar with carbon reporting, it's not rocket science, but fundamentally, as an organisation, you need to get, let's say, your electricity data for a particular period and then apply something called an emission factor to it, which is a sort of standardised agreed multiplier, which you apply to a kilowatt of electricity to convert it into a ton of CO2 equivalent. And in the old way of doing things, we perhaps, there was a bit of a debate between us and divisions about what the right emission factors were to use, or even in our kind of group roll up sort of consolidation spreadsheets, we perhaps weren't as active or assiduous in getting the kind of emission factors updated as quickly as possibly we could. But when you drive it through a system, you remove all of that risk of error or inconsistency, and all of those emission factors are just locked down and updated as and when the government department designates changes them, and the system does all the calculations now. So that as well is an improvement area for sure.
And if you're looking more sort of to the sort of forward-looking impact of ESG, are you now evaluating the targets that come about as looking at those metrics, looking at what if scenarios, and if so, how's that helped?
Yes, very much so. So as I said earlier, in the old way of doing things, we definitely, I felt, spent too much of our time, necessarily so, just gathering and reporting the data and checking it was correct and so on, and spending far too long getting to the actual numbers. Whereas now we have that through OneStream, we have the confidence in the generation of the numbers much more quickly and with much less effort on our part. So it does enable us to instead look at analytics of the data, if you like, and tie it with other business variables like capital expenditure or what have you. So we're definitely using it to sort of try and plot trends of this thing's changing over here, what's it doing to our carbon emissions, etc. And using that as a bit of a backward look. But also, we have built a system to allow forecasting capability. So the setting of those science-based targets about 3 or 4 years ago, what it basically, for our scope 1 and 2, we have a target to reduce our emissions by 63% by 2035 on a 2020 baseline. And what that equates to is, in simple terms, as a business, we need to reduce our emissions by X% per annum, on a downward trajectory up to 2035. And we recently published our first climate transition plan to map out what exactly, what actions we're taking as a business, both in our bus and our rail division, to achieve those reductions. And of course, a lot of those things will necessarily be supported by CapEx. So, for example, in the bus business, we have a commitment to have a fully zero emission commercial bus fleet by 2035. So we're literally per annum increasing year on year our number of electric buses and our depots that have electric charging infrastructure, etc. And it's through OneStream and this better visibility and better frequency of data, as I said, we'll be able now to much better plot on one axis, the number of electric buses or CapEx electric buses, and on the other axis, the reduction is, what it's doing to our scope 1 and 2, for example. And all of that will be driven by having a much better system, platform in place like OneStream, so that we can focus our time on those analytics rather than the manual work of getting the data in the first place,
Brilliant. And I think I remember one of the anecdotal comments from one of our team referring to the fact that as a result of the reporting that was done on the finance side of the house, there was an awareness of how much you were investing in running the trains. but there
Yeah,
wasn't necessarily an immediate awareness of how how efficiently those trains were being run, until you started collecting some of the carbon data next to it and joining the dots,
correct.
to the
Yeah.
extent that I think the amusing anecdote was that you actually managed to spot which drivers were driving which trains, based on the fuel consumption of the train on the same route and the same timetable, which you would never have found from just pure financial metrics.
No, exactly. And that's another thing that, is going to be such a benefit of the system, is that drill down, not just to a division, but down to a company, or even down to a depot, let's say, in the bus division. Like, we it took a long time to get it right, but we've got that capability now to, not just at a business level, explore those relationships between variables, but even down to, the level of a depot, let's say. From over the course of a year, they've got X many new electric buses, and over the course of that year, what's happening to the scope 1 and scope 2 in that depot. Really having that really granular drill down, of course, is used, because then you can use those analytics to showcase to sort of leadership teams, well, this depot's doing great, this depot less so. Why is that relationship between carbon emissions and EV buses slightly less obvious in that depot versus that depot? What are the reasons for it? Then you get into that that's the cool bit, where you kind of, the analytics lead to new thinking or decisions being made off the back of it.
Brilliant. So just moving more to the sort of reflections then, in terms of, looking back then, how important is the ability to accurately report ESG performance to FirstGroup's future plans, if that's not repeating what we've just said?
Well, ESG data generally has become important, but certainly carbon emissions are right up there and are now effectively as important an indicator, in our business as, let's say, margin or revenue, or it's a really important indicator, and it has that status now that we can't get it wrong. It's a really, so therefore we have to have a system in place that gives us complete and accurate data. There's no way around it, I would say. It's absolutely fundamental that we, and also, as you were saying earlier at the start of the call about regulation and compliance, that's by putting in OneStream, we're definitely trying to get ahead of that as well. We know that there will be an expectation, particularly under the UK sustainability reporting standards, that for certainly under what's called S2, your carbon data needs to be subject to robust assurance. And whilst we already have an independent provider, Grant Thornton, review our carbon data, we know that project to review it will be far smoother and more efficient on OneStream, because everything can be so much more auditable and so much easier to sort of, the traceability of a data point is so clear now on the system. And so, as it will likely be the case that assurance over ESG data will become more and more robust as these sustainability reporting standards come in. So we're sort of future-proofing ourselves really by having a system that is audit ready, and will likely expand to other ESG indicators in the future. We started with carbon, but the next one on the horizon is potentially safety, let's say. We're not currently subject to external assurance over our safety data, but I can see a future where that, not that far off, where that will be required of us, and therefore having a system like OneStream in place to gather and report the data and then run it through assurance is, again, just a no-brainer, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So finally, if you consider the benefit of OneStream to FirstGroup, and more specifically to your team, can you put that into a one-liner?
Great question. Insight and action versus effort and and reporting, let's say.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Martin. Much appreciated. Great. Well, I really appreciate Martin's time invested in this, because it gives context to what we're about to share, with the help of Simone from OneStream. So I'm going to hand over to Simone now. Thank you also, Simone, for joining us, who's going to show you some product.
Yes. Thank you very much. Sound check.
Yep, we're good.
All right. I'm going to share my screen now. So welcome to OneStream. We've heard a lot about firsthand experience and how the tool is being used. Let's have a look at how OneStream can support an ESG reporting journey. We are logged into an application over here. This is a demo app. So a little disclaimer here, it's a demo app of a mocked up company producing golfing equipment, and not only. We will see how we can consume information on OneStream, and then how we have actually gone about a process of retrieving some actuals, inputting some forms, and potentially also planning for the ESG KPIs that we want to monitor. So here you have a landing page of how the ESG solution could look like. There will be a focus at high level or some highlights on some indicators. For example, we may want to dig into some more environmentally related KPIs, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 as an example. So in OneStream, we provide all those analytical services that you may need, that BI functionality to produce those trend charts, heat maps, graph charts, and what have you, in order to consume and digest that type of information in a swifter way. Of course, if we think about another way of representing data, maybe I can switch here to some social indicators where I have a breakdown of the workforce, maybe by gender, maybe by professional figures, maybe by age gap, and the representations in stacked column charts or pie charts. Again, just another way to portray that information that we have collected within the organization that we work in. Now, narrative commentary shares a first level degree relationship with the data, and that is also, I think, quite relevant not only for other types of reporting than what we do, but specifically for ESG reporting. As we've heard today, OneStream is a solution that can be used for many different processes: financial, external, regulatory reporting, ESG reporting. Narrative has a very fundamental role. Here is a way in which narrative is embedded into the solution, for example, for how we track on the US and SDG goals. Now, how do we get to this point? How do we get to the point in which we can start consuming that information? Here to the left, you have an example of what a workflow could look like in an ESG reporting process, right? So if our goal is to get to this overview, let's think about how we get there. We think about conversion factors. I may need to have the possibility to import all the different conversion factors there are out there. I may have my own conversion factors as well. Our solution has them already available. We partner with Climatic for this. So the solution that OneStream provides has an automatically updated list of conversion factors that the users can go and select and then add to their application for their reporting purposes, activate or leave them inactive depending on the different standards and frameworks that we'll see next that they report on. So this list is maintained for the end users. The end users will receive a pop-up notice of when some KPIs have been updated, and then the users will be able to select them and use them. And of course, you can also have your own internal conversion factors that can be loaded into the solution itself, be that manually, factor by factor, or be that by an upload of a flat file or whatever other source system you have, because as we've heard, data quality is a fundamental cornerstone of OneStream. Let's think about frameworks. There are several different frameworks to which the different organizations need to comply to. And so we have another partner in this journey that automatically keeps up the maintenance of the ever-changing regulatory nature of those frameworks, the updates and the adoptions of the new standards within those frameworks. That partner is ESGO, and it provides that in the solution directly to be consumable by the end user. And again, here you have an example of an ESRS framework with the materiality impact. You can go in and look at all the different disclosure requirements that you may want to have and may want to include in your report. All right. So once we have now loaded the appropriate factors and considered the relevant frameworks by which we want to report, then we can think about some data input. And again, we will see how we might want to go into the solution and start inputting data for a region, for an operation site, for however the organizations are structured. What you see here is a bird's eye view of how that would look like in terms of a task management, right? So we're trying to give structure to this reporting as well. There are certain tasks that have not yet been started. There's one that is in process over here. Right now, of these, none have been submitted. Others have been completed for the whole organization. We can delve into each and every one of those tasks. Now, let's go into loading some emissions data that we've talked about today. When we do this, we see how the step for loading emissions has several different sub-steps over here. One is the first one, to import some data. So that will look like this, an area where I import data to the connected source system, or where I import flat files, for example, of this data. OneStream, by design, always has auditability turned on, so I know exactly what that source system was, with what date and timestamp that load has come into. In the validate step is where, if there is a new factor or a new KPI that I'm monitoring and I need to map it there, then I will go and take care of it in that step. But most importantly, I may have certain confirmation steps, right? Did I load all the information pertinent to scope 1 fuel? And here you have it. Here you have a warning in orange. So it might not maybe slow down or might not maybe halt the process, but I instantly have a view on the fact that there was no data loaded for scope 1 related to vehicles for that specific entity, for that specific business unit or operation site. Here is where I'll have the possibility to check the emissions data that is coming into the solution. So you will see, for example, the actual numbers of those indicators, the variance with the prior period, and the activity that has been loaded, with a breakdown on, for example, the entity levels, the account levels, and the details here that you have by factor. I'll open up this pane here just to give you that workflow view concept that we were mentioning in the experience that you heard firsthand from the session before, and you will see how everything that the end user will be doing is actually governed by a workflow. So we are guiding the end users in their journey to load data, insert data, do some inputs, right? And then report on them. So let's move forward. With this step, I'm going to close that pane. It's always there for you. We can talk a little bit more about, again, data input. Once I've achieved the goal of bringing in some emissions data and other social data, for example, now I want to be able to gain further insights, yes, but maybe potentially plan for them, because the next step usually is that executive management teams say, okay, if I've obtained this level of this KPI that I'm monitoring, how do I expect to perform by the end of the next period, or by the end of the next relative scenario? So I may want to have the possibility to go in and start planning for certain one of these emissions factors, right? And data input plays a big role. Let's see how that can look like in OneStream. Here you have the possibility of breaking it down to whatever period you may want for whatever year. And then obviously, of course, add commentary, whether that's required and needed for that specific planning process. I will still have the possibility of going into those numbers and understanding what they are made up of, where they came from, if it was a roll forward of an existing KPI, and then if there have been adjustments that have taken place on top of that. Ultimately, when I go into inserting certain assumptions on where I may improve certain performance or certain targets that I want to obtain, I also will have the possibility of having those visuals pertaining to the different projects and strategic initiatives that I'm putting in place to, for example, accomplish some emission savings in terms of CO2, or to tie into these strategic initiatives that are usually maybe planned for from a finance perspective, tie in to those also ESG variables. Okay, we are going to go for that project of converting, I don't know, golf carts from gasoline to electric. What will be the useful life of those? When will we start seeing some offset of CO2 in what years? So when will we also have certain results from, in this case, an ESG perspective? All of this into one application, one product, one data model. So ultimately, I think we can close on here. Once the end users would go through a process such as the one that I'm giving you a little bit of a glimpse upon and that we've built on this demo app, they will start to then compile their different reports for the different standards that they are adopting. Let's just wait one more second here until this loads. I think what it will produce in the meantime is the pre-compiled ESRS report for those entities that pertain to this group, to then use that in the next step of depositing that report to the external regulatory bodies. We will come up with that report that can be then put into a greater sustainability report where we can add certain narrative, and that is the point of the next two steps before I leave it back over to the studio. There you go, a template of that report based on the activities that we have completed. I can see how then I can go and create my sustainability report. There we have it. So where we can collaborate across different departments to create the report full of narrative and key metrics that I have obtained during the workflow that we've just gone through. And of course, how I can build up that report is shown in this next step, where I'm breaking down that report into sections, and I can forward one of the sections, right, to a group of users, and then have different people working on a document that will be merged, put together, and be presented as our sustainability report. Here is that narrative reporting capability with all the Office 365 experience that we may have. So if I'm going to go in here, I can just show you the markup that we have. There we go. Someone has started editing this, and then this is actually narrative with the data that is embedded in the solution that we can go and use to compile and to create that report. That brings me to the end of the demo, and I hand it back over to David.
Thanks, Simone. Much appreciated. That's a great taster, I think. There's so much more we can show. But I think in the time allowed, that gives everyone a good flavor of what's possible. I think I'm done too, so I'm going to hand off to Carrie. I don't know if we've had any questions in the intervening period.
Yes, we have had a few come through from the audience, and we've also had some sent to us ahead of the event. So the first one is for Martin. Has the technology changed the way, so I assume they mean the OneStream solution, has it changed the way that senior leadership engages with your ESG data?
Yeah, yes, it has. So the reason for that is just the ability to utilize insights to the data more regularly and effectively over the course of a year, rather than just as part of our year-end process, which is kind of June time for us. So yeah, we have a board committee for sustainability. It's called our Responsible Business Committee, on which I sort of sit. And for example, yeah, just tracking performance, let's say on our Scope 1 and 2 emissions, we're able to do throughout the year now and give kind of summaries of why we think that's happening and what, if we're behind, what could be done about it in those committees much more regularly now. So yes, it is being used.
Great, thank you. And Simone, I think this one is probably best answered by yourself. Someone's asked about the emissions factors that are in OneStream. Is the pipeline of acquiring these factors from DEFRA/DESNZ automated? So I suppose they're embedded in the solution already?
That's a great question. Thank you. So yes, the conversion factors, we actually retrieve them from Climatic, and they are maintained by Climatic. So Climatic will also tell us when, for example, there's been an update to a single conversion factor. Rather than telling us, what it will do is it will prompt the individual end users in the solution who have the user profiling to do this, and it will consult with them and ask them whether or not to adopt that new updated conversion factor, stick with the old one, or see which other ones need to be activated. But this is a service that is automated, yes, and taken care of for the end users by us on our end.
Brilliant, thank you. Another one for you, Martin. You've already touched on kind of the transparency aspect. You now have transparency into your data after using OneStream. So would you say you're finding it easier to respond to external ESG audits or investor queries now?
Yeah, well, exactly, we are. And I think one aspect that's really interesting in that aspect is as in terms of responding to queries is that drill down capability. Because like a lot of large organizations, we do a lot to sort of submit to ESG benchmarks and kind of have ratings for various organizations. But what we find when it comes to investor queries is they typically have quite specific questions, often related to a part of our business or a particular initiative or decarbonisation activity we're working on, very often related to our bus business and the progress or otherwise of our electrification efforts. And so this, we're able to, on those calls now, as I say, just kind of track the progress of one depot versus another and use the sort of insights from OneStream to better guide those conversations with investors, and that they've responded quite well to it, really.
I suppose this is just a general this is just a general question for any of you. Someone has asked, do you have any advice for other companies who are starting their ESG reporting journey? Sorry.
I think don't aim for perfection straight away. It's best to kind of go out there, gather what you can, assess the current state, and then go from there over time, really. So, as I said at some point on the call, carbon reporting isn't hugely complicated, really, at its core. You ultimately need to gather and source data that should already be within your business, be it kind of energy data or other kind of related utility data, and then go from there. Being a bit simplistic here, but you can start from those simple foundations and then look to kind of enhance and improve it over time. It took FirstGroup several years really to get to the point of being able to kind of implement and deliver a platform solution. So if you're starting out, it's no bad thing necessarily to try and gather the data on your own steam initially, but then once you've got something, you can I think move to a platform reasonably quickly after that, because it will ultimately save you a lot of that manual effort over time. But it is important to kind of source the data in the first place, and again, using a system that your business is perhaps already using for financial reporting would be a good place to go looking for it, as opposed to sort of bypassing that entirely and trying to get it by other means,
And I'd also add to that as well, in the sense that in a lot of cases where we've worked with this sort of data, as I touched on earlier in the presentation, some of the people we're reaching out to actually source that data are not used to working within this sort of framework. And so it's trying to actually make sense of the relevance of the information that you've got and work out where those gaps are. And to Martin's point, I think what we did initially was we've made provision for integration with the likes of the reporting model using the integration technology, but where there's a less mature picture or landscape in certain parts, then we've allowed for manual collection in the interim until the details of it available further down the line. So it's baby steps in the right direction. I think the importance is actually the reliability of the data and the quality of it. so that you can actually act on it with the right intent.
Thank you. We have had one more question come through. Simona, this is maybe possibly best directed at yourself. How would the system apply if you were to move from spend-based to supplier-provided data for Scope 3 carbon reporting?
All right, that's another great question. So if I understand it correctly, it's about getting information from a supplier for Scope 3 carbon reporting. Well, again, OneStream's core pillar stone, the thing that it was founded upon, is data quality. So we can connect to any source of information out there and make sure we get it right the first time around, whatever information we're bringing in. So if we were to move from spend-based to supplier-provided data for Scope 3, we would then retrieve that information from another source, run it through our data quality engine, and use that for our reporting. The information doesn't need to be presented in any particular format. We can adapt to whichever format that is coming through. I'm thinking now, if the supplier provided information comes through, I don't know, instead of a live connection to a data source, but from a flat file, we read whatever is out there and the end users in a drag and drop functionality can quickly say, okay, this is where the KPI is, this is the values, and this is how it will be brought into the solution.
Great. Thank you so much, Simone. Well, I think that's all we've got time for today. We're nearing the end of the session. Thank you to everyone for attending, and thank you to David, Martin, Simone. That was extremely helpful, I think, for everybody who's joined. The link to the recording will be sent to you in the coming days, so keep an eye on your emails and feel free to share it with anyone you think might be interested. If you've got any further questions for David, Martin or Simone, please do feel free to reach out directly on LinkedIn, and we'll do our best to try and answer them for you. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye now.